If a new CEO, president, CFO, CAO, or COO is hired by a public company or is promoted from within the company will need to file a Form 8-K with the SEC within 4 business days. However, an 8-K is not required for the hiring of other types of named executive officers, other NEOs, today on Zippy Point. I'm Brock Romanek, and I'm a big fan of you. So the officers that trigger, an 8-K is required under this item when the company appoints a principal executive officer, president, PFO, which is a CFO, the principal accounting officer, principal operating officer, or any other person performing similar functions. The determination whether a person is one of these officers, that I just named, the PEO, the PFO, the PAO, the POO, is based upon that person's function and not necessarily their title. That's important to know. The terms are not specifically defined under the Exchange Act. The terms executive officer and officer are defined under the Securities Act Rule 405 and Exchange Act Rule 3B2, 3B7, and 1681F. So you're going to want to refer to those. Anyway, note that the other NEOs, and usually you have 5 NEOs, although it might vary between 4 and 7 depending on your circumstances. I have a separate Vid-Guide about how you determine your NEOs. So it's usually 3 out of the 5 that are not captured by this 8-K requirement because your CEO and your CFO will be. In fact, it's even possible that the officers identified in this 8-K item that trigger an 8-K filing won't even be considered an NEO. It's rare, but it does happen. But the 8-K is still required to announce their appointment, even though they're not an NEO. This is fairly rare, but it still does happen. Didn't I just say that? Note that if a new officer will also now become a director, the 8-K would also be filed under item 502D, as in dog. It's fairly common for a newly hired CEO to also be made a member of the board, to become a director. And there's an 8-K filing requirement for that. And a single Form 8-K can accommodate more than one item within that 8-K, so you can use the same 8-K to announce the hiring of a new senior manager, the CEO, and identify also the new director, who is also that same CEO. Note that the new officer that triggers an 8-K might be one that is just a temporary CEO or CFO. Maybe there's a gap in leadership due to an officer passing away, or maybe the CEO is suddenly fired due to a scandal, or maybe the CEO is incapacitated due to illness. So you might have a temporary and interim person serving in that role, and an 8-K will be required. See my separate Vid-Guide about disclosure considerations if the CEO becomes seriously ill. So here's an example of a Form 8-K to announce an interim CEO appointment. Note that a Form 8-K should be filed if the appointment was first temporary. There's an 8-K for that. It's an interim appointment. But then a new 8-K will be filed if the interim appointment is now made permanent. The interim CEO is now made the permanent CEO. The board has made that decision. In my opinion, a new 8-K is better than amending the original 8-K announcing the interim appointment, and here's an example of that. So what do you disclose? The Form 8-K must disclose the name and position, the appointment date, and a brief description of any material, plan, or arrangement that is part of the appointment. Usually it's compensation related. But this does cover arrangements, whether they're compensatory or not. Maybe a new CEO was appointed because there was a controlling shareholder who insisted that this particular person got hired. You're also required to provide the disclosure in this 8-K that is elicited by item 401B of Regulation SK, the age of the officer, the 5 years of business experience, any related party transaction information elicited by item 401A of Regulation SK. If the officer is newly hired to the company, you'll need to briefly describe their compensation arrangements. They're going to probably have some, right? If an officer is promoted, it's likely that their pay will be bumped up, so you need to disclose that. Even if it's a raise that isn't part of a written employment agreement, that would still need to be included. So this type of compensation disclosure is required even if item 502E of Form 8-K isn't triggered. We'll talk about that in a separate Vid-Guide. If the raise isn't material to the executive, that arguably wouldn't have to be disclosed. Maybe it's just $10. But materiality is hard enough to determine when it comes to evaluated in the context of a company. What is material to an executive? It would seem that almost any amount over a couple $100 might be. If this compensation information is not known when you file your Form 8-K, you'll need to file an amendment to the 8-K later with this information within 4 business days of having that information. The meaning of appointment is not precisely defined either in the instructions to the Form 8-K or by SEC staff guidance. Typically, practitioners interpret it as the earliest event to occur in the chain of events associated with the employment process. But the triggering event typically is not some action by the board. For example, if an officer signs an employment agreement or an offer letter a month prior to joining the company, depending on the wording, the appointment may occur when the officer signs the employment agreement rather than when formal action is taken by the board. That happens after that. The appointment date matters because that's the date you're going to list as a date of event on the cover of your Form 8K, but the filing of the 8K is permitted to be delayed until the new hire is publicly announced as permitted by instruction to item 502C. The 8K would then be filed exactly on the same date of the public announcement. You can't wait 4 business days like a typical 8K triggering event. It's common to delay the public announcement, particularly if it helps the optics of a smooth transition between one CEO and the next. So here's an example of a Form 8K. This single 8K announces the new CEO at the same time as the resignation of the prior CEO. So the timing was managed to accomplish this. As noted in this Corp Fin staff interpretation, if you're delaying the 8K until the date of the public announcement and the officer is also being named to the board, the 8K required by 502D can also be delayed. The challenge here then is, what about the date of the earliest event reported that you have on the cover page when you're delaying the announcement? If you use a pretty old date, maybe some will think that your 8K is late. I think the risk here is fairly minimal, and I would just use the date of the appointment on the cover as the earliest date. But quite a few companies use the date of the public announcement, and that works too. The SEC staff isn't likely to comment if you do it either way, so then there's certainly zero enforcement risk from the SEC. So here's an example. It notes the appointment was made on February 9th, but the appointment wasn't effective until February 27th. This 8K was filed on the 27th with the date of February 23rd on the cover. That's the date that the interim CEO stepped down. So this 8K is actually an 8K for an 502B situation, the interim CEO stepping down. Item 502C situation, there you have a new CEO, and a 502D situation where the new CEO is also a new director. I have Vid-Guides available for all these other sub-items of 502D available on zippypoint.com, and a link to which are below. Let me know what you think.